Good afternoon and welcome to the afternoon edition of Day 2 of the Public Sector Debate Competition Preliminary Round 2. I'm Aniki Clark, and it's indeed my pleasure to have you join us, be it online or here in the room at Saxthorpe. We've had some very interesting matches since morning, right, Judge? Absolutely. Chair Judge, yes. Some teams have cemented their positions in the octafinals, and we continue this afternoon to see the other teams that will advance to the very important round of the competition. This afternoon, we have with us in proposition the Jamaica Tourist Board. Let's give them a round of applause. And in opposition, Jamaica Trade Board Limited. It was a bit of a tricky one because they are both JTB, right? But there is one JTB and then there's another JTB Limited. So that's the distinction that we have this afternoon. And they will be debating the moot. Be it resolved that parametric insurance instruments like CCRIF are more cost-effective post-disaster financing mechanisms for Jamaica than maintaining large sovereign emergency reserves. You know, we've just come out of Hurricane Melissa, and this is very topical, and I look forward to the arguments by the teams as they advance their arguments. But let's get to meet them, starting with Team Proposition, Jamaica Trade Board. Please introduce yourselves. Jamaica Tourist Board, JTB. Let me just say JTB and leave it at that, right?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Crystal Smith, first speaker for the proposition.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alistair Anderson Motta, second speaker for the proposition.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Stasian Virtue, third speaker for the proposition.
Thank you very much, Team Jamaica Tourist Board. Let's now hear it for Jamaica Trade Board. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Treasure Anderson, first speaker for the opposition.
Good afternoon. My name is Chanel Harriott. I am the second speaker for the opposition.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Dew Harris, and I'm the third speaker for the opposition.
Thank you very much, Team Jamaica Trade Board. At this point, I will invite the judges to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Aniki. Hi, everyone. My name is Jermaine Barrett. I'll be the chair adjudicator for this match.
Good afternoon, everybody. Kenisha Nelson, and I will be one of your wing adjudicators for this match.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kalisa T. Vassal. I'll also be serving as a wing adjudicator. All the best.
Thank you, Jermaine. You're the only male amongst the debaters. You're the thorn among all these lovely roses.
No. The rose between two thorns.
Okay.
Just joking.
And at this point, I will hand over to you, Jermaine, to marshal the match. Good luck, teams.
Thank you very much, Aniki. All right, so teams, you have been briefed of the rules already, but for our viewing audience, I'll go through them just to fill in everyone and bring everyone up to speed. So both teams having 3 debaters. The first debater will speak for 7 minutes, the second for 6, the third for 5 on each team. After the first 2 set of speeches, we will have a period of cross-examination. We'll have another period of cross-examination after the second pair of speeches. Thereafter, we'll have a pause of 1 minute, and then we will resume with the reply speakers from the opposition first. Then the proposition will conclude the debate. Teams, please take note of the time signals. You'll hear the ding of a bell, signaling that you've spoken for 1 minute. A ding of the bell again signals that you have 1 minute remaining. 2 dings of the bell signal that you've consumed the allotted time, and thereafter we give you 15 seconds because we're kind. 15 seconds thereafter, grace period, at which point you must end your speech. All right. That applies specifically to the first 2 speakers on each team. The second speakers, you don't you will be getting the signals just the same, but no points of information are allowed. So points of information are allowed in the first two speeches when it is that you have, if you're the first two speakers rather, after the first minute up to the last minute of your presentation. But for the final speaker in the debate, the reply speakers, no points of information are allowed at all. All right? So those are the rules. We are ready to get the debate started. So at this time, I call upon the first speaker from Team Jamaica Tourist Board, the proposition to open this debate. Hear, hear.
Honorable adjudicators, esteemed audience, good day. On June 7th, 1692, disaster struck without warning. The ground beneath Port Royal shook violently, and within minutes, an entire city was swallowed by the sea. Centuries later, when Hurricane Melissa devastated Jamaica on October 28, 2025, the country was far better positioned to respond strategically and efficiently because Jamaica had joined Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Financial Facility, hereafter referred to as CCRIF, in 2007. This debate is ultimately a comparative question of value per dollar in the critical post-disaster window. Do large sovereign emergency reserves deliver greater cost effectiveness? Or do parametric insurance instruments provide a smarter, faster, and more fiscally responsible solution? We stand firm on the proposition that parametric insurance provide a more cost-effective solution. Before I get into the key arguments, let me begin by defining the key terms of the moot. One, parametric insurance instrument is defined as financial instruments that trigger payouts based on measurable events such as hurricane and earthquakes rather than assessing losses. Post-disaster financing has to do with funding in the immediate aftermath when response speed is critical and survival hangs in the balance. Sovereign emergency reserves are government savings set aside requiring internal allocation and deployment. Finally, when you look in the context of cost effectiveness, it is not only measured by the impacts per dollar spent, but also by, does it deliver fast access to funds? Does it minimize fiscal strain and debt? Or does it reduce economic loss? Yes, it does, and on these metrics, parametric insurance wins. Parametric insurance is more cost-effective for Jamaica because it reduces fiscal strain through risk sharing and regional risk sharing rather than forcing the country to bear catastrophic disaster independently. Through mechanisms such as CCRIF, Jamaica pays predictable premiums, in return have access to substantial payouts when qualifying disasters occur. This fundamentally shifts a significant portion of the financial risk away from the government and onto the wider insurance framework supported by regional risk pooling and international capital markets. Sovereign emergency reserves require Jamaica to carry the financial burden independently. The government must accumulate and maintain large sums of idle capital in anticipation for future disasters, despite the uncertainty about when these disasters will occur or the severity of them. This creates a significant opportunity cost. Funds that could otherwise be invested in economic development remain tied up in reserve accounts. In effect, citizens are allowed to indirectly bear this burden through constrained public spending or increased taxation. This challenge is even more severe given Jamaica's high debt to GDP ratio and fiscal constraints. Not accepted at this time. Building and maintaining massive reserves is not only economically restrictive, but also unrealistic and expensive for a developing country already balancing debt and developmental priorities. More critically, when disasters exceed the value of those reserves, as they often do, the government is forced into emergency borrowing at unfavorable terms, increasing public debt when the economy is most vulnerable. Certainty, we have seen where a single catastrophic event can exhaust years of savings overnight that creates even greater fiscal strain. Ultimately, for economies like Jamaica, regional risk pooling and risk transfer are cheaper and more sustainable. They're also more fiscally responsible than attempting to self-insure through large sovereign reserves. The evidence is clear. Large sovereign reserves require Jamaica to tie up scarce capital, absorb fiscal shocks independently, and so shoulder catastrophic risk alone. Not accepted at this time. Parametric insurance, on the other hand, transforms uncertainty into predictability by transferring risk, preserving fiscal space, reducing reliance on emergency borrowing in a time when Jamaica needs it the most. Furthermore, parametric insurance is more cost-effective because it delivers fast, predictable liquidity for life-saving measures, enabling faster economic recovery. Unlike sovereign reserves, which are often slowed by Government of Jamaica internal processes, parliamentary procedures, administrative approvals, and exhaustive damage assessment, parametric insurance schemes such as CCRIF provide rapid and reliable post-disaster financing within 14 days once predetermined triggers are met. This removes bureaucratic delays and allows government to respond with urgency. Jamaica is one of the clearest examples of this. Following the devastation of Hurricane Melissa, the moment the wind speed threshold was crossed, Jamaica was guaranteed liquidity without lengthy process. Within a fortnight, the country received approximately US $91.9 million within a couple days. This payout provides Jamaica with immediate liquidity to respond to urgent needs, stabilize services, and protect fiscal sustainability. This speed proved critical. It enabled the government to restore electricity and water to crucial areas, clear roads, erect emergency hospitals, and provide food, shelter, and medical assistance to vulnerable communities without delay. How is this relevant to you and I? Because the government's ability to respond with urgency in the aftermath of a disaster is literally the difference between life and death. Delayed access to sovereign reserves increases economic loss. When you weigh the balance of cost-effectiveness on when you weigh the standard of balance of cost-effectiveness, the conclusion is avoidable. Parametric insurance are the better choice. However,
we thank the first proposition speaker for opening this debate, representing Team Jamaica Tourist Board. We now call upon the other JTB, that's the Jamaica Trade Board Limited, yes, JTBL, to open their case from the vantage point of opposition. Here.
Panel, which mechanism delivers the greatest post-disaster solvency at the lowest overall cost? Today we argue that it is sovereign emergency reserves. We propose 4 metrics for determining cost effectiveness and how it is measured: coverage adequacy, flexibility of use, payout terms, maintenance costs. These metrics represent the most critical factors best for addressing this debate, as not only does it encompass factors such as return on investment based on cost for maintenance and coverage, but also costs such as solvency. First, coverage adequacy. We would like to know whether or not the payment can cover the crisis in a substantial way. Second, flexibility of use. Can flexibility be deployed discretionary, allocating monies to any disaster at any scale? Is that a possibility? Can discretion be used to assist displaced citizens or prepare relief supply? Third, payout terms. We think time is also a cost as well. How fast can the mechanism be mobilized for recovery? Fourth, maintenance costs. How much money is spent to maintain either mechanism? These metrics are important as they account for all inputs required for the benefit of sufficient post-disaster financing mechanisms, which constitutes cost effectiveness in essence. Jamaica is highly exposed to escalating natural disasters, from hurricanes and floods to earthquakes and landslides, with 82% of the population living within 5 kilometers of the coast, and a large number of centers, industries, essential services concentrated in vulnerable low-lying areas, often 0 to 10 meters above sea level, apologies. What this means is catastrophic events can devastate the country as even a localized rainfall. A parametric insurance is not your typical insurance that involves payout which depends on the actual financial loss and damages sustained. Instead, it pays out at occurrence of a specific event by paying a predetermined amount based on the magnitude of the event, as opposed to the magnitude of the losses in a traditional policy. Panel, not accepted. Panel, the coverage allocated after the disaster is likely to be inadequate, riddled with hidden costs and funding gaps, exposing it to lack of flexibility for discretionary means to address disasters of any scale. With that, payouts are triggered by preset of critical conditions rather than actual damage on the ground. This means that some disasters may cause a severe damage, yet fail to trigger payouts because they do not meet the contractual thresholds. For example, a storm may devastate farming countries, the roads, home even, and we fail to pay out because it did not meet the required wind speed. How could this be? And secondly, this also means that sometimes, even if payouts occurred, that they could only cover a portion of the actual losses suffered, being that the amount was predetermined. What this coverage actually does is that it creates delays in damage repair, which causes compounding costs over time. As a result, critical infrastructure remains damaged for extended periods of time, which causes businesses' productivity to decline in economic activities, tourism reduction, budget reallocation, reducing monies previously allocated to other sectors. And you guessed it, the government may have to now borrow additional monies to close the financing gaps, and while still paying premium. Crisis solvency is the ability to provide adequate financing recovery. These funding gaps worsen disasters response over time, with the delayed recovery bringing increased long-term repairs costs, whilst damaged roads continue to deteriorate. So when recovery is underfunded, reconstruction is slow, which would inevitably undermine the purpose of cost-efficient post-disaster financing. The implication of using parametric insurance instruments for post-disaster recovery is failure, from inadequate coverage, thereby placing Jamaica in a worse-off position. This means that we would not get proper solvency from using parametric insurance instruments only. It must be supported. In simpler words, Jamaica end up paying twice. Once for the premium and once for the additional cost to close the financial gaps created by the policy. This duplicated expenditure cannot be more cost-effective. On the comparative, sovereign emergency reserve does not depend on these critical triggers. It does not require. This is particularly important as Jamaica experiences many smaller disasters, which would not ordinarily meet the threshold for triggering the payouts for insurance, but commencing recovery efforts is a must. With that, the reserves provide a broader and more reliable coverage, which would better achieve post-disaster solvency, which is what we are debating. It is important to note that Jamaicans' most damaging events would not even trigger the insurance payout. In this regard, we think Sovereign Emergency Reserve will close this funding gap significantly by allowing governments to be able to solve crises of any scale, giving greater coverage and greater flexibility. So rather than fasting for days and praying for triggers to be met to initiate the payout, the answer, sovereign emergency reserve. Our opponents will try to paint parametric insurance instruments as most cost effective, but in reality, what we want is a mechanism that when it is triggered, it adequately covers all scale of post-disaster financing for a country as vulnerable as Jamaica. We want a mechanism which is flexible, which is reliable, and providing short and long-term security, not supplementary systems with rigid triggers. We don't need a system which asks, did the disaster meet the model? We need a system which asks, what do you actually need? For these reasons, we strongly reject this motion. I thank you.
We thank the first opposition speaker for her presentation. And now we move to the first segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the opposition team, Team Jamaica Trade Board Limited, gets a chance first to ask 3 questions of the proposition team, Team Jamaica Tourist Board. Each of the questions is limited to 10 seconds. Each response limited to 45 seconds. Team JTBL, you may ask your questions now.
Can the proposition guarantee that every major disaster will meet the payout triggers?
Parametric insurance is not necessarily guaranteed to meet every single trigger, but the big disasters that is important, that needs a lot of money for funding, trust me, we cannot save enough money to cover those disasters. I'm sure we did not have enough money in sovereign reserves to be able to facilitate recovery, a 2 trillion Jamaican dollar recovery from our sovereign reserves. That's impossible. CCRIF and our catastrophe bond from the World Bank was able to facilitate that.
So you're saying that CRIF cannot CRIF cannot pay out on all the, cannot guarantee a payout on every disaster. But what about the disasters that causes significant disastrous impact on the country, and it does not meet the threshold? How we deal with that?
If a disaster in Jamaica causes severe damage but falls short of international trigger thresholds, the government relies on the pre-arranged domestic layers in the National Natural Disaster Risk Financing Policy, the National Disaster Risk Fund, and the restoration of owner or occupant family shelters. These are the domestic layers that exist within our national budget to supplement the local needs when international triggers are not met by large-scale natural disasters. No, they are not. No, they are not.
Opposition, do you have another question?
We do have another question. So in the event, sorry. All right, so in the event that there is a landslide, how do you suggest there is major rain within a particular country, low-lying parish rather, how do you suggest, in your world, how would we fix this problem?
What we're saying as the proposition, while parametric insurance is a much more cost-effective mechanism than sovereign reserves, we welcome a balanced approach, as Jamaica currently do. They have a balanced approach, a layered approach where for smaller disasters, they will use sovereign reserves. But for bigger disasters, once the triggers are met, parametric insurance is more sustainable for the government for the long term, because once economic recovery is delayed, it costs the government more. Hence, the triggers from parametric insurance, supplementing the sovereign reserve, eliminate the need for emergency borrowing.
Thank you very much, Team Opposition, for your questions. Thanks, Proposition, for your responses. Team Proposition, Jamaica Tourist Board, you may now pose your questions to the Opposition bench. Here, here.
To the opposition, can you explain how locking away billions in reserve funds produces greater economic value than paying relatively smaller insurance premiums?
I could justify this by saying simply, a lot of the disasters or the crisis that Jamaica faces is not typically big enough to meet the metrics that is already predetermined under the parametric insurance. And with that, monies can be taken from the reserve funds to fill these gaps. Additionally, monies within the parametric insurance would not take into consideration all that can be taken into consideration with the reserve fund, because the reserve funds, we can use the discretion that cannot be used with the parametric insurance. And as such, a lot more can be covered with the reserve funds.
Question to the opposition. You're saying that we're not facing grand disasters, but how would you say that when we've had two back-to-back hurricanes, Hurricane Beryl, Hurricane Melissa, 1 year after the other? Is reserves going to be sufficient to recover from those back-to-back disasters in a climate-changing world?
If we should take the funds that we invest in the parametric insurance and invest it in our country, rather, that amount, the returns on investment is what we could use to build the funds, and it should adequately suffice to recover from any disaster. There are researches that shows that in 2023, there are about $5 billion that was invested in the emergency reserve, and there was another point where they had invested $2 billion. Also, there's another point where, given Melissa, they have realized that CCRIF did not pay out enough to cover Melissa, so they have decided to start inputting $200 million in the reserve mandatorily.
All right, thank you. Thank you both teams for an exciting exchange of questions and answers. Sorry, you may proceed with your other question. My apologies. Go right ahead.
Your first speaker would have mentioned sovereign reserves provide flexibility, but how do you account for flexibility without speed that allow the country to continue to generate additional loss and expense?
You said flexibility without speed. With parametric insurance, it is said, according to their own brochure, that it takes within 14 days for funds to be dispensed because they have to go through their verification models. As compared to the emergency sovereign funds, it is available within country already budgeted and is ready to be immediately dispersed. While we were waiting on CCRIF, the funds that we have, that is what we used in Melissa to distribute and pay out persons to go and start clearing roads. So that is how we know that parametric insurance is not cost effective compared to emergency reserve fund, because it is outside of our country and we have to depend on international personnel to determine payout and to do other things.
All right, thank you so very much for now concluding the first segment of cross-examination. We move the debate right along with the presentation now from the second speaker from Team Proposition. Let's make them welcome. Here, here.
Honorable adjudicators, my opponents, and my esteemed members of the audience, good afternoon. The opposition attempted to weaken our case through three main arguments: coverage inadequacy, maintenance costs, flexibility, and a fourth one, post-disaster solvency. However, these arguments collapse when placed against Jamaica's actual economic and climate realities. Firstly, the opposition argued about the idea that Jamaica may suffer damage and not receive a payout if the disaster does not meet the trigger requirements. But this argument ignores one critical fact. Parametric insurance removes uncertainty and delays during moments of national crisis. In a recent article discussing parametric insurance, BCMG Managing Director Damian Craig stated, and I quote, "When payouts are based on trusted data, there's no debate about whether damage qualifies. It gives clients peace of mind at a very stressful time. That same peace of mind applies to the government of Jamaica and to Jamaican citizens." When a hurricane or earthquake strikes, citizens should not have to wonder, how will the country recover? Where will there even be enough money? How long will we suffer before assistance comes? During disasters, people are already fighting fear, displacement, flooding, and loss. The last thing a country should be doing is scrambling to figure out where recovery funding will come from. And let's be honest, we got 70.8 million US within 2 days of Hurricane Melissa from parametric insurance. The opposition is stating that parametric insurance provides inadequate coverage, but they are ignoring a much dangerous risk associated with sovereign reserves, the possibility of not having enough money. When disaster strikes repeatedly with CCRIF, we received rapid, pre-arranged financing. Parametric insurance solves a delay problem because the financing mechanism is already in place before disaster strikes. Jamaica simply needs to weather the storm knowing that all is well. Once the trigger is met, funds will come quickly and predictably. Quick financial, not accepted at this time, support bridges the gap between disaster and recovery, allowing Jamaica to get back on its feet faster. Therefore, it is way more reliable than sovereign reserves because we're not even sure if we have enough money in sovereign reserves to cover major disasters. Secondly, the opposition argued about maintenance costs. And they are assuming that insurance premiums are too expensive. But what is expensive is trying to maintain massive sovereign reserves in a developing country already facing debt obligations, infrastructure needs, healthcare demands, education costs, and crime challenges. That is a massive burden. It may sound attractive in theory, but in practice, this is not a cost-effective method to maintain large sovereign reserves. Sovereign reserves are finite. So once that money is spent after repeated disaster, it is gone. The government is then forced to borrow money, increase taxes, the delay development projects not accepted at this time, or divert funds away from critical sectors simply to recover. And let us remember, climate change does not wait for Jamaica's reserve to refill. The opposition is claiming that parametric insurance is not flexible, but this is not so, because it did not meet threshold. However, parametric insurance takes into consideration a variety of disasters, from flooding, tropical storms, hurricanes, and earthquakes. There are different tiers to parametric insurance. So parametric insurance has already demonstrated real results through Hurricane Melissa, unlike reserves. For example, we had a much slower recovery from Hurricane Ivan than Hurricane Melissa, as we had to rely on sovereign reserves as well as loans to recover from Hurricane Ivan. Therefore, you can tell that we are learning from experience on how to handle these disasters when they come. And sovereign reserves can be politically difficult to maintain and protect. So therefore, there are many cases where we've seen fraud in the government and money that we should have to use for Jamaica is being spent on other things. So dear adjudicators, parametric insurance instruments like CCRIF are more cost-effective for Jamaica because they allow the country to make relatively small premium payments while receiving significantly larger payouts after large-scale catastrophic disasters. If Jamaica relies solely on sovereign reserves, billions of dollars must remain idle in anticipation of disasters. In contrast, parametric insurance allows the government to transfer disaster risk to insurance through relatively small annual premiums, while freeing national resources to continue funding critical development priorities such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, and national security. In fact, member countries of CCRIF save an estimated 35 to 50% in annual premium costs compared to purchasing individual coverage. So disasters are no longer rare for Jamaica. So with more frequent and intense hurricanes creating repeated economic shocks, Jamaica was still recovering from Hurricane Beryl when Hurricane Melissa struck, and parametric insurance through CCRIF provided 4.1 billion Jamaican dollars after Beryl, while after Melissa, we got approximately $39 billion from not only CCRIF, but the World Bank Catastrophe Bond, helping to offset our recovery that estimated at $2 trillion. Do we have $2 trillion in sovereign reserves? I don't think so. So can you imagine Jamaica trying to solely recover based on sovereign reserves? These payouts allowed us to strengthen our national resilience. So, therefore, we see where parametric insurance has helped not only the country at large, but also Jamaican citizens. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now move to the opposition side to hear from their second speaker. Here.
Panel, good afternoon. Jamaica faces deadly leptospirosis outbreak after Hurricane Melissa. Health official reports multiple deaths and cases. Mr. Speaker, let us look beyond the theory and examine the realities Jamaicans lived through in the West after Hurricane Melissa. Some communities were left without electricity, water systems failed, roads were impassable, citizens were marooned within their communities. Hospitals destroyed, shelters overcrowded, while some residents were forced to sleep among the dead. Videos flooded social media with desperate cries. These are articles that shows the direct results of the wait time to receive funding and other resources. Panel, my first speaker has established 4 critical metrics to evaluate true cost effectiveness: comprehensive coverage, discretionary spending, operational speed, and maintenance. My extensions in this debate centers 2 things: operational speed and cost for maintenance. In respect to operational speed, my first claim is that sovereign emergency funds are operationally quicker and easily mobilized than parametric insurance instruments. Why is this the case? Because quick is a relative term. Parametric insurance instruments like CCRIF take up to 2 weeks in order to mobilize and dispense funds. This is because, 1, they have to spend time gathering data from different meteorological sources to determine the triggers, such as wind speed and the amount of rainfall. 2, technicians have to navigate their multiple verification steps to determine if the country qualifies for any sort of coverage and the extent of coverage. 3, then they have to pay out funds. The impact of all of this is that it creates immense and significant delays, particularly during times of crisis, where a quick and rapid response is required. This matters because where delays exist during times of crisis, there are costs compounding. This means that the more we wait, the more suffering adds up, the more economic loss incurs, and it becomes harder and more expensive to solve crises. These are costs for delays that is inherent to parametric insurance. On the comparative, we would suggest, not accepted, we would suggest that sovereign emergency funds take far less time to disburse, effectively making crisis management far more timely. There are 3 reasons for this. Firstly, the government already controls the funds internally through the national budget system and emergency fiscal mechanism. This means that the funds are more immediately accessible and can be reallocated between ministries and agencies to deploy for crisis management. Secondly, even though the government has to go through its own verification steps, we think it is far less time consuming. Why? Damage assessment is far easier because it is not based on full-scale damage assessment, but rather based on the most critical and apparent damages. This is easily accessible given that these types of damages are far easier to identify and therefore quicker to solve. Importantly, the government escapes the cost of compounding damages over time because it solves the most critical damages to prevent further suffering, economic loss, and stagnation. This illustrates the difference between 2 weeks
and a crisis management response of 2 days, because the government is able to solve the most urgent demands immediately as opposed to waiting 4 days. This accounts for the capacity of the government to respond more quickly to crises. But beyond capacity, what incentives does the government have to more rapidly respond to crises? We think it's the democratic incentives. That is to say, there is a massive public pressure on the government to solve the crisis quickly because of how burdening disasters can be for our citizens. Secondly, crisis management also affects the electability of politicians during the next cycle of election, and because politicians want to stay in power, they want to respond to the incentives. This means that the heavy bureaucracy that would ordinarily happen during instances of procurement isn't likely to happen because there is a significant pressure on the government to respond quickly. The impact of this panel is that we are able to allocate resources immediately where needed, the most without requiring full-scale damage assessment. This is to say, we don't need to count all damages, rather only the ones most critical to functioning of the country, thereby leaving non-critical damage to be solved as time progresses. On the other point of maintenance, we would suggest that we incur less benefits at the point at which parametric insurance is the instrument used for disaster and crisis management. This is because Jamaica, as a disaster-prone nation, is likely to experience small-scale disaster on a more frequent basis. The problem with this, however, is that a lot of small-scale disasters don't meet the trigger threshold for maintenance. The implications of this is, one, we actively invest our money in instruments that give selective returns. This means that even if small-scale disasters occurs that might have significant impact, if it doesn't meet the threshold, then we cannot receive payout. On the comparative with emergency reserve, we are far better able to allocate funds for financing a wider range of disasters and crises when we have access to sovereign emergency reserves. This is because government have far more discretion when using its own sovereign insurance instrument, but it's because it sets the terms for what it finances and what it pays out. That is to say, my opponents, sovereign emergency reserves are therefore more cost-effective than parametric insurance. Thank you.
We thank the second speaker from the opposition team in this debate. We now move to the second segment of cross-examination. In this second segment, the difference as compared to the first segment is that the proposition team, Team Jamaica Tourist Board, gets a chance first to ask their 3 questions of the opposition team, Team Jamaica Trade Board Limited. Team Proposition, you may proceed with your questions.
Our first question for the opposition: can you guarantee that Jamaica's reserves would always be large enough to cover repeated catastrophic events?
I think that is not what we are here to debate. We are here to debate which is more cost-effective. And in debating which is more cost-effective, the allocations is not what it is that would come out. However, to answer your question, However, to answer your question, yes, I do believe with constant investment within the fund, the money can grow enough to cover all disasters. It is supplementing parametric insurance, so it could do damage on its own. I thank you.
To add to that, it's the reason for this is because when you take parametric insurance into consideration, after using that, it is not sufficient to cover all damages. And if it's not sufficient to cover all damages, then we have to go externally to get more funds as compared to if we use our sovereign reserves, we would probably be able to cover the damages quickly rather than it compounding more disaster.
How do you account for cost effectiveness with sovereign reserves when it is not enough to facilitate economic recovery, and delayed economic recovery increases the cost to the government? Hence, Jamaica is in a position to not being able to generate income from tourism, which contributes to majority of GDP.
Sorry, could you repeat that question, please?
How do you account for cost effectiveness with sovereign reserve when it is usually not enough to facilitate recovery fast, and that puts Jamaica economy in a deficit where we're not able to earn money and we're losing, especially from tourism and agriculture, which contributes to majority of our GDP.
So we will count for it in terms of we have to put reserves within the budget. Reserves is a part of the budget, such as the parametric insurance. However, if it is that we should do away with that premium that we pay to the parametric insurance and focus on getting the sovereign emergency reserve all the way up, that could be the way that we would penetrate the disasters when they happen.
And to add to that, a part of those funds could be invested in our country so that we can we can get returns on investments. And just like the bank takes our savings and they do their necessary investments, and that's how you receive your interest, and that's how you receive your interest on your savings.
But parametric insurance can be considered as investment because we do get a payout, and therefore, and also, parametric reserves is strictly for weather-related disasters. So how is sovereign reserves? Yes, how is sovereign reserves? Is the sovereign reserves only for weather-related disasters? Or is it for other economic crises as well?
Sorry,
so a combination.
Your question is not clear.
So I'm asking you, our sovereign reserves, is it only to fund weather-related disasters, or is it used to also fund other crises such as economic crises as well?
It is discretionary, so therefore it is more flexible than the instruments such as CCRIF. And on that point, where you had referenced the ability for it to be, if the fund will be sustainable or enough, we can measure that against the investment that a country like Jamaica will make in parametric instruments such as CCRIF, where if we do not meet the threshold of those metrics, irrespective of what Jamaica has invested, we will lose every single bit of that dollar and none will be returned. So which is better, losing it all or having some reserve to address a situation which we are not paying interest for?
Questions, and we thank you for the questions and answers. We now ask that the opposition team pose their questions to the proposition team.
My question, the second speaker made reference to parametric insurance removing uncertainty. Can you explain how that is the case?
Yes, for sure. There's already metrics in place, so once the disaster meet the triggers, and we know parametric insurance, there's levels. So once, for example, a Category 5 hurricane, it will automatically trigger the parametric insurance. So before the hurricane even finishes, we already know we're going to get a payout from CCRIF and we're going to get a payout from the bond that we have because it's already set in place. That's why it makes it certain that once these disasters come, we will definitely have a payout and have money to go ahead and do our recovery. Please bear in mind that also starts processing once it lands on Jamaica. So even before the hurricane has ended, the money starts processing to pay out because it has met the trigger.
That is understood, but if the trigger is not met, we have a landslide. Sure, sorry.
What happens below or over the trigger?
So for instance, a Category 3 and it has caused a major landslide.
Sorry, just to reiterate, what happens below the trigger if it is that the disaster does not meet the trigger, and what happens if the disaster exceeds the already predetermined amount?
So for the parametric insurance, we have a variety of things that meet the trigger. So it starts as low as flooding, just to note. Also, we also have other mechanisms that are set in place. The contingency fund, which was already mentioned, the National Disaster Risk Fund, and also the consolidated fund that is not a part of the sovereign reserves.
So you say cost effective. when the government is considering opening another portfolio for utility restoration when it is a direct impact from any hurricane and storm, shouldn't that be covered under the insurance?
As a country, the government sustains the infrastructure. And so as we continue to grow and develop over time, there are improvements that must be made to our infrastructure, our road network, our telecommunications, etc. So to suggest that CRIF should be responsible for ongoing national development would be erroneous.
Furthermore, to add to what my teammate just said, that is the reason why the government seek these external parties to cushion the financial risk for the country.
All right, thank you very much, ladies, for that speech, rather those questions. We are now going to pause for 1 minute. Thereafter, we'll resume with the reply speakers' presentations from either team, beginning with that from the opposition. Then we conclude with the proposition's reply speaker. Teams, your 1 minute pause begins now. All right, so that signals the end of your pause. We now resume with the reply speaker from the opposition team, Team Jamaica Trade Board Limited. Let us make that speaker welcome. Hear, hear.
Good afternoon, panel and opposition members. Thank you for having me. The opposition accepts that parametric insurance can assist recovery. However, this debate is not about whether CRIF or parametric instruments are useful. This debate is about whether it is more cost-effective and more reliable than sovereign emergency reserves. Our response is simple. Speed means nothing if coverage is insufficient, and assistance is not the same as security. Panel, this debate was never about whether parametric insurance is useful. The opposition has already accepted that CRIF can provide support of after disaster. The real question in this debate is, which mechanism provides Jamaica with the most reliable, flexible, adequate recovery financing at the lowest overall cost when disaster hits? Another question, and on that question, the proposition fails. They fail because their model depends on technical triggers, limited payouts, even in the billions, and external conditions, while sovereign emergency reserves provide direct national control, flexibility, and broader recovery capacity. Today, I will address central flaws in the proposition's case. Speed does not equal effectiveness. The proposition will likely argue that the parametric insurance provides quick payouts, but panel, quick funding does not automatically mean adequate funding. This matters because Jamaica's challenge after disasters is not merely getting money quickly. The challenge is getting enough money to properly recover. Opposition has already demonstrated that parametric insurance depends on present technical triggers, such as rainfall intensity and wind speed, rather than actual losses on the ground, irrespective of the variety of disasters mentioned by the opposition. This means that communities may still suffer severe flooding, infrastructure may still collapse, farmers may still lose livelihood, and roads may still become inaccessible. While Jamaica either receives limited compensation or no payout at all, a disaster does not stop being a disaster simply because an insurance formula says the threshold was not met. And even where payouts occur, they may still cover only a fraction of the actual losses. So yes, proposition may give Jamaica quick money, but if the payout is inadequate, Jamaica still faces funding gaps, delayed reconstruction, reduced economic productivity, and additional borrowing. A fast but inadequate solution cannot be more cost-effective. Fast funding is not sufficient funding. Proposition cannot claim flexibility while depending on rigid formulas. Under sovereign reserves, Jamaica decides where the money goes. Jamaica decides which sector the money goes to, or rather where it is prioritized, and Jamaica decides how recovery efforts are structured. That level of national discretion simply does not exist under parametric insurance. And to add, parametric insurance makes no facilitations for the private sector. So, should disaster hit, we cannot rely on parametric insurance to satisfactorily cover expenses for Jamaica in its entirety and not just the members of the government of Jamaica. That level of national discretion simply does not exist under parametric insurance. A benefit is mutually exclusive when it can only fully exist under one model. Immediate discretionary access exists more strongly under sovereign reserves than under parametric insurance. When Jamaica controls its own reserves, Jamaica controls its own response. The comparative analysis that we will take from this: under the opposition, Jamaica controls emergency financing directly. Funds can be deployed according to actual need. Recovery efforts remain flexible, and the government can prioritize urgent sectors immediately. Panel, parametric insurance may assist recovery, but assistance is not the same as security, and supplementary support is not the same as national resilience. If Jamaica wants true disaster preparedness, true financial flexibility, and true recovery capacity, then sovereign emergency reserves remain the most cost-effective solution. For those reasons, opposition firmly asks the panel to reject this motion. I thank you.
We thank the third speaker from Team Jamaica Trade Board Limited for concluding the opposition's case. At this time, we welcome to conclude the debate overall the third speaker from the proposition Jamaica Tourist Board. Hear, hear.
Honorable judges, distinguished opponents, and esteemed members of the audience, good afternoon. As proposition third speaker, my responsibility is not to introduce new arguments, but to demonstrate why we have won this debate on the balance of probabilities. And after carefully examining both sides, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. Parametric insurance instruments like CCRIF are far more cost-effective for Jamaica's post-disaster financing needs than maintaining large sovereign emergency reserves. Throughout this debate, we consistently showed three things. Number one, parametric insurance delivers rapid liquidity when speed matters most. Second, it reduces fiscal strain through risk transfer to the insurance company and regional burden sharing. And third, it allows Jamaica to recover from disasters without crippling development or overburdening taxpayers.
Our opponents, however, failed to disprove these core realities. Instead, they relied heavily on theoretical concerns about flexibility, premium cost, and coverage adequacy. But when we compare that theory to Jamaica's actual disaster experience, their case simply does not stand. Judges, let us begin with the central issue: speed. We have proved repeatedly that in the aftermath of disasters, delaying financing increases human suffering and economic loss. We demonstrated that parametric insurance mechanisms such as CCRIF provide rapid payouts within days once the agreed triggers are met. The opposition erroneously focused on the maximum time frame of 14 days and not the reality of the experience. Quite frankly, our opponents could not give us a realistic alternative. They could not explain how sovereign reserves that are tied to bureaucracy approvals, reallocations, and the political process could realistically move faster than the pre-arranged financing already guaranteed. And speed matters. In addition, we proved that rapid financing saves lives, shortens the recovery time, and reduces the long-term economic impact. The opposition never disproved this link between speed and economic efficiency. We showed that sovereign reserves would require Jamaica to tie up massive sums of capital despite already facing debt obligations. The opposition attempted to argue that reserves provide control, but control without sufficient resources is meaningless. There is very little value in controlling a reserve account that can be depleted by repeated disasters. And importantly, the opposition never answered one fundamental question: can Jamaica realistically reserve tens of billions of dollars after every major hurricane season while still developing the country effectively? They could not answer because it is clear: no. The opposition focused on the possibility of a missed payout while ignoring the far greater danger of delayed financing, depleted reserves, emergency borrowing, and prolonged economic paralysis. The evidence shows that the mechanisms from parametric insurance schemes are already working in practice. Jamaican farmers, our vulnerable communities and people, and critical sectors have already benefited. And that is the key point in this debate. The moot was never about choosing perfection. It was about choosing the more cost-effective financing mechanism for Jamaica. And on every major metric, the speed, the fiscal sustainability, the economic recovery, and national resilience, we, the proposition, have prevailed. So when the adjudicators retire to deliberate, we respectfully ask one question. In a country increasingly threatened by stronger hurricanes, worsening floods, and repeated climate shocks, which system better protects Jamaican lives, livelihoods, and economic stability? A reserve account, slowly built over time, or a rapid pre-arranged financing mechanism specifically designed to provide immediate liquidity when catastrophe strikes? The answer, honorable judges, is clear. The faster dollar is a cheaper dollar, the shared risk is the smarter risk, and the parametric insurance scheme is the most cost-effective choice for Jamaica. For these reasons, we definitively close.
We thank the proposition team for that speech just now, and thank all the debaters in this round. At this time, we turn over to Aniki Clark, who will now conclude this segment of the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Jermaine. What a way to end day two. Let's hear it once more for the teams. We had the Jamaica Tourist Board and the Jamaica Trade Board Limited debating the moot, be it resolved that parametric insurance instruments like CCRIF are more cost-effective post-disaster financing mechanisms for Jamaica than maintaining large sovereign emergency reserves. The arguments have been made, and at this point, it's up to the judges to decide the winner of today's match between these two teams, and we invite you to stay tuned for another 20 minutes or so when the judges return, and Jermaine will sum up the match and announce the winner. Thank you very much again, teams.
You have just witnessed the battle of the JTBs, the Jamaica Tourist Board versus the Jamaica Trade Board Limited. And boy, what a match it was. May I invite you to give them a round of applause for a job well done. The moot that really governed this debate looked at what is the better approach, or the better approach for treating with the aftermath of a disaster, likely a natural disaster. Should we pursue a parametric insurance mechanism, or should we go the route of establishing and tapping into a sovereign emergency fund? Which is preferable? Team JTB, that's the Jamaica Tourist Board, tells us that we really should be more reliant and lean more towards, of course, the parametric insurance fund. And why do they say so? They say that it's better because the risk, as happens with insurance generally, are shared across and by all the persons who are investing in the insurance. And so the premium, that which is paid on an incremental basis, is less overall. They weigh that against what obtains in the world of a sovereign emergency fund, where necessarily for you to have a large payout, the government must pay into it a significant premium, because only then will you have that large payout. They say that Jamaica, being a relatively economically weak country, we're really financially challenged, doesn't have the financial means to make those kinds of investments. And we kept hearing this figure, $2 trillion being floated about in this debate, because that is, on average, roughly speaking, the cost of one disaster's impact, that of Hurricane Melissa. Now, we found it interesting that the parametric insurance mechanism does not provide full solvency for the aftermath of the disaster. But on the other hand, we hear that sovereign wealth funds have the capacity to treat with and solve almost entirely the aftermath of disasters, right? To which proposition says, no, it's not like that, because you really won't have a sovereign fund large enough to offset the aftermath of the disaster, right? Now, we think that that is likely to be the case, that Jamaica isn't likely to have a sovereign fund as large as $2 trillion. But even if Jamaica does, it is also very much the case, and both teams seem to agree, that disasters happen on such a frequency and on such a scale that to tap into it in the first instance, where the disaster is valued at $2 trillion, wipes out the fund and leaves the government with nothing remaining. That we consider to be a major concern on the part of opposition. A concern that doesn't exist, certainly not to the extent that it exists in opposition. It doesn't exist as much in the world of the parametric insurance, insofar as the insurance is being renewed and the principle is likely to remain roughly more or less the same. Okay? Now, the other question that arose in this debate is the question of timeliness. How quickly can we get access to the urgently needed resources to offset the critical crisis that confronts the country? Now, we hear that in the world of parametric insurance funding and financing, we have to wait a maximum of 2 weeks, right? But in reality, certainly the Hurricane Melissa experience tells us that the funds are released as quickly as 2 days. Yes, very, very quickly. But of course, we understand the 14 days is to allow due diligence and to satisfy the authorities that, yes, there's a disaster that has occurred, warranting X amount of payout, right? What obtains in the world of sovereign emergency fund? In that world, the funds are immediately accessible, can be tapped into. So the disaster happens just like that, and possibly even, who knows, same day, we have access to the money, right? Question, though, is how significant is the difference in timeliness with respect to the parametric insurance fund mechanism versus the sovereign emergency fund, right? How significant is it? And we don't think that, for instance, in a case where we'd have seen a 2-day payout, or rather 2 days between the disaster and the payout, versus what may very well be a shorter time or a time thereabout, we don't think that there's a meaningful distinction between the two, okay? The second issue that we weighed in this debate is the question about whether or not there's going to be adequate coverage in terms of scale and magnitude. When we talk about scale, we're talking about the frequency of disasters. Obviously, the parametric insurance fund does not provide insurance coverage for all and every single instance of a disaster. So Flatbridge, there's a rain and Flatbridge is covered over and there's some damage there. Likely, it's not going to be, the government is not likely able to tap into a parametric insurance fund for that. Other mechanisms exist, as side proposition pointed out. The natural disaster funds exist that the governments can tap into for smaller scale disasters, or it can tap into other reserves that it has. But it doesn't. It is precluded based on the mechanisms existing with the parametric insurance fund from tapping into that pool of funds. Is this a disaster? Is this a bad thing? We think that it's not such a bad thing insofar as other pools of resources exist, again pointed to by side proposition, right? Now, does the availability of our immediate access and the capacity of the government to recognize that it's its own fund that it can use however it wants, is that reasonable, and is that a reasonable advantage for the use of, or for the adoption of sovereign emergency funds, right? We think that it is an advantage. Again, we don't know that team JTBL, that's Jamaica Tourist Board Limited, that they prove the Jamaica Trade Board Limited, that they prove the significance of this advantage, right? And we think that a lot of the argumentation from Trade Board Limited is a little bit exaggerated insofar, again, the scale and magnitude. They haven't proven that sovereign emergency fund can, in fact, assuage those particular concerns, okay? So in the long run, on the question of timeliness in terms of accessing resources, we don't find that there's a meaningful distinction. We think that maybe there's an increased rapidity with which you can access the sovereign emergency fund, but we don't think that the difference between that timeliness and the timeliness that exists in the world of parametric insurance fund is significant. And secondly, we don't think that, in terms of the scale, in terms of the coverage, we don't think that Jamaica's sovereign emergency fund will exist at such a scale to cause the government to have capacity to use it and it alone to essentially mediate and eliminate all the harms that persist, that pretends, or that come about from the particular disaster in question. Okay. So with all that in mind, the scores reflect a fairly significant margin between the two teams. The winning team ends on 284 points. It's 284 points for the winning team, and that compares to the second place team's 269 points. Ladies and gentlemen, the winners of this match in round 2 of the public sector debate competition for 2026, they are a team called JTB. It's the Jamaica Tourist Board. So congratulations, Jamaica Tourist Board. And the best debater also comes from that team. That speaker, ladies and gentlemen, really, really excellent in terms of the argumentation and the structure and everything. That was, in fact, the third speaker, the reply speaker from Team Jamaica Tourist Board. One of the things I want to comment on quickly as I wrap up is a line of argumentation from the second speaker on Team Jamaica Trade Board, the incentive structures for governments to respond and to respond quickly. We think that that's a powerful argument to prove, the incentive, the likelihood of governments to respond quickly. But that was an argument in aid of another argument, and the other argument that he was trying to bolster and buttress was, in our estimation, as I explained before, not an argument that was being won significantly on their side, given the fact that even the worst case scenario of a 2-week wait is not that deleterious in our estimation. as a panel. All right? So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of day 2 of round 2 of the public sector debate competition for 2026, the 5th staging of this competition. We applaud you, we thank you for being here with us, and we look forward to having you join us again tomorrow when we have 4 other matches featuring 8 teams duking it out to move on in an attempt to advance to the octafinal round of this competition. Thank you all.